welcome back to my channel, Beautiful Minutia. If you're new here, my name is Tiffany and we are winding down the 12 days of Christmas. It's day 10, so there's only a couple of days left. And today I wanted to talk about the 12 worst books of 2022. Before I get into that, I just did want to pop a reminder in here that I had mentioned in my goals and channel changes for the year video that I am opening up a Patreon and a Discord. And so I just wanted to announce, in case you have not seen the announcement, that both of those are live now and both of them are linked in the description of my video. There's no pressure to join either of them, but I just wanted to let you know that they're there. Okay, so 12 worst books of the year. These are over all genres, and these do not include any DNFs. DNFs are coming. That is a video that will be here. But these are the 12 worst books that I completed. They span a variety of genres. We have some classics, we have some middle grade, we have some historical fiction, we have some contemporaries. We've really got a little bit of everything. I did try to theme it as 12 books, so it goes with the 12 days of Christmas. But if I'm being honest, some of these books are really like not the worst, whereas some of them really are. And I hardcore hated some of these books, and this will probably turn into a little bit of a rant at a certain point. So if some of these books on this list are books that you loved, and I have a feeling that a couple of them might be, because some of them are newer releases that were kind of favorites of the year for some people, please do not take it personally at all. They just didn't jive with me, and if you loved any of the books on this list, I am so glad that you had a better experience with them than I did. I may also have to get into slight spoilers for some of these books in terms of why I disliked them so much, and if that's the case, I will have timestamps in the description so that way you can skip around if you don't want to be spoiled if there are spoilers there. Okay, so let's get started. I'm going to start with the least bad of the worst books. So my number one book on this list is going to be the worst book of the year for me. So coming in at number 12 is Rassless by Samuel Johnson. This book is not the worst, okay? I just think it could have been better, and I was disappointed by it. There were things I did enjoy about it, things that I did glean from it, but overall, this is supposed to be a novel, but it would have been better if it had been more in an essay format, because really all Samuel Johnson wanted to do was to explore what really makes you happy. So it's really more of a philosophical discussion than anything else. However, it is also true that Samuel Johnson wrote this book within the course of, I think, a week, because he was trying to get money quickly to help his dying mother. So when you look at it that way, it's actually pretty impressive, but overall it's pretty forgettable and was really disappointing if you're expecting some sort of adventure story, because you really don't get that. In spot number 11, we have When You Trap a Tiger, and this is not the worst book. Obviously, it's number 11 on my list, but it was so disappointing because this is a Newbery book. And I find it really hard to believe that there weren't better books than this. So When You Trap a Tiger is about this young girl who is moving back to the town where they came from because they're trying to help her grandmother, I think, is kind of the premise of the story. And the hook for me was that it involved lots of Korean folk tales. And unfortunately, that was really a lie. We basically got one Korean folktale that kept being retold and more details being added to make it more relevant to the main character's situation and the stories that were going on. So that already was kind of a disappointment. In addition, while I feel like the main character was really well done, she was really struggling with shyness and things like that, I felt like that was so well explored and she was really well fleshed out. I feel like every other character in the story was a caricature. You had the weird, outgoing, nerdy kid that wants to be her friend. You had the super angsty, throwing fits about everything teenage sister. You had the mom who's so stressed about everything that she can't see that anyone around her is struggling, and none of those were actually ever taken further than that. In addition, the older teenage sister is continually sneaking out at night, and her mom doesn't know, and the younger sister knows, but the younger sister feels pressured to keep this secret and not tell anyone, because that's what good sisters do. And this is never addressed in any meaningful way. There is never any discussion about how maybe this teenager should not be sneaking out in the middle of the night in a town where she doesn't know anybody to meet up with somebody. Maybe the younger sister shouldn't have felt pressured to keep a secret that could potentially be dangerous and result in her sister dying. Maybe the mom should have known. No, you don't get any of that. Instead, you get this normalized version of kids sneaking out, which is really funny because as a kid, I never snuck out. Not one time. Neither did my husband, and neither did a single one of my friends in high school. So, I'm not saying that high schoolers never sneak out of the house, but maybe it's not as normal as it's being portrayed in this novel, and maybe we shouldn't make it look cool and normal to middle graders who might decide that they want to do that at age 10, 11, 12 because the cool big sister did it in this book and never got in trouble for it, and nothing dangerous ever happened to her. So I find that really problematic in a middle grade book, and that definitely impacted my rating of this book as well. Moving on, I think that this is going to be an incredibly controversial book to have in space number 10, Remarkably Bright Creatures by Shelby Van Pelt. This is a contemporary, and it had potential because it's basically about this octopus in this aquarium and this elderly lady who cleans the aquarium at night as a job, and the two of them kind of forming this bond. Unfortunately, I felt like the perspective that we get from the octopus is the only perspective that's really that good. I did like the elderly lady, but I felt like there wasn't a lot of character development. She is Scandinavian, and she kind of like holds herself aloof from everyone, including friends and other people. And it just seems like she's annoyed by every other person, but we don't really get that much of a glimpse into her that I felt like we could have. But the really egregious thing about this book is that there's another perspective, a young man named Cameron who acts like he's 17, but he's my age. He's in his 30s, and he acts like this big man child, and he's so whiny, and he likes to victimize himself and never takes responsibility for anything, and is super immature, and I don't even feel like he really grows that much as a person, and his perspective was just incredibly annoying. And oddly enough, the fact that he's even in this book is not mentioned anywhere in the description of the book, which is weird. I just didn't like it. I just didn't feel like it was worth it. But it was a debut novel by this author, so I feel like she has promise. I think that the premise was interesting, but I didn't really like the execution. And I have heard quite a few people say that this is their favorite book of the year. So I'm glad that so many people enjoyed it, but I'm just finding that contemporaries really usually do not jive for me. In space number 9, we have The Lost Apothecary, which I believe is another debut novel. And interestingly enough, this has one of the best opening chapters of any book I've ever read, and it really went downhill for me. This is a dual timeline. So we have one timeline that takes place in modern day and one that takes place in, I think, like 16 or 1700s, somewhere in there, about this apothecary shop that procures poison for women to kill their husbands, basically. And I don't like most books that have dual timelines, and this book proves why, because usually you don't need both timelines. Usually one of them ends up being pretty superfluous, and I felt the same way about this one. I also didn't love the ending. I felt like it was kind of weird and seemed a little tacked on, and there is a lot of discussion about infertility, infidelity, miscarriages, and periods, like pretty much in every single chapter of this book, and that was not enjoyable to read about. And I really felt like, in particular, like the period discussions were really weird because there's this girl that gets her period and she has no clue what it is, so she thinks that it's like some ghost haunting her or hurting her, and it's just like a whole thing and it's everywhere, and I just don't understand why it needed to be there. Again, interesting premise, much like Remarkably Bright Creatures, but not great execution in my personal opinion. And space number 8 is The School for Good and Evil. This is a middle grade and it was on my Read or Rid project for 2022 and I got rid of it. This is a book that is very like fairy tale-esque and I liked that about it. And I really liked the premise of these two young girls who end up getting sent to this school. One of them goes to the School for Evil, one of them goes to the School for Good. So one of these schools is training up future heroes and princesses and the other one is training up like witches and villains and things like that. And I thought that was really a really interesting setup, but I found that the friendship in the book between these two main characters is like lauded as such a great friendship, and it is incredibly toxic and codependent. And I felt like it was a really poor example of a friendship, but yet it's held up to be a good friendship, especially based on the ending, which I felt like the ending was awful anyway. But the ending implies that this was such an amazing and deep friendship. And it wasn't. It was terrible and involved people using each other. And I'm like, why is this being lauded as a great friendship to children? Like, children can do better than this, both in how they treat others and in maintaining relationships and maybe not being friends with people who are toxic and learning to set boundaries at a young age instead of just letting themselves be walked all over because it's their friends. Moving on is Reckless from Cornelia Funke, also on my Read or Rid project for 2022. I love Cornelia Funke to death, but this book was not it. This book, it had such great fairy tale vibes, and it's about this guy who finds this mirror in his dad's office when he's a kid and realizes he can go through the mirror into a new world, and then skip forward to him being an adult and what's going on with all of that. And it just had really terrible character development, and by terrible I mean it actually had like no character development. The plot was just left a lot to be desired. There's a lot of plot holes, a lot of things that didn't make sense, and yeah, we'll move on. Next is The Purloining of Prince Oleomargarine, which is a book that was originally begun by Mark Twain, and it was continued by Philip and Aaron Stead, and they also did the illustrations. Illustrations are gorgeous and pretty much the only really good thing about this book, to be honest. I would give the illustrations 5 stars, but the story I would give 1 star, maybe 2 stars, because it was very tongue-in-cheek and very funny at points, but the story didn't make a lick of sense at all. And I realized it was supposed to be a silly story that Mark Twain made up for his kids, I think. But when someone else decides to take an unfinished story that just has like basic notes written down and decides to make it into a story that feels like it came from this author, it usually falls flat, and this fell very flat in that department. Number 5 is The Children of the New Forest, which I wish I had loved. I read this aloud to my daughter for school, and she actually did love it. And I was bored to tears. There was nothing I enjoyed about it. I felt like it was very long-winded. I felt like it was very impractical, and I didn't really like any of the characters. I felt like it was very like overly sweet and everything was tied up in a bow at the end, and I didn't love it. Okay, we're down to the top 4, or if you want to say the bottom 4, however you want to say that. These are books that I actively hated and kind of only finished out of rage. So the other books on this list had some redeeming qualities, and I feel like these bottom 4 didn't have many. So we're gonna start with The House of the Seven Gables by Nathaniel Hawthorne. I wanted to like this book. I really did. There were elements to it that were kind of interesting. So it's about these two families, and one family kind of takes over the property of the other, and there's kind of this rivalry that has gone on, and now we are following these families generations later, and there's a curse on one of the families, and that element was really interesting to me. But there's so much of it that didn't make sense, and now I'm going to go into spoilers, so look at the timestamps if you don't want to be spoiled. But okay, so they have this guy who is like living with the family, I guess, and he is a writer and also into like hypnotism, I think. And so he has written the story of what originally happened to one of these family members' girls, and this guy who is a descendant of one of the families comes in and hypnotizes her, and now anytime he wants, he has control over her and can make her do anything that he wants. And so she ends up dying from this, and he has written this down in a manuscript, and as he reads it aloud to the young girl who is like the main character of the story, he accidentally hypnotizes her by reading the story about hypnotism. And when he realizes he's hypnotized her, he's like, I'm not going to take advantage of this. I'm releasing my hold on her. I'm like, first of all, how do you accidentally hypnotize someone? And then later at the end of the book, they're apparently in love, despite having had very little interactions that were meaningful at all. And then I'm like, wait, so did he actually hypnotize her? Because he said he didn't, but that's the only thing that makes sense for her declaring love to him. Like, what? When that happened in the story, I literally out loud went, what? Are you kidding? And only finished the book because I had very little of it left. And I was like, I'm just going to finish this sucker, and basically hate read the last like 50 pages of this book. But a book that I disliked, I think, even more than The House of the Seven Gables is News of the World by Paulette Giles. This was also on my Read a Read project. I am seeing a theme here. There's quite a few of these that were. So this book sounded like it would be interesting. It's about this guy who he goes around and he shares the news at different towns. Like, he gets his news from this port, and this is before people could easily get newspapers. So he goes around from town to town and he shares the news. He like reads it, and he ends up with this young girl who was kidnapped by Native Americans, and now she needs to be brought back to her family, and he's going in the direction where her family is, so he agrees to take her for money. And it's basically their journey. I didn't like a lot of things about this book. There were very, very glaring inconsistencies. Things like there's a shootout and their cook stove is badly, badly damaged, but wouldn't you know it, the next morning she's cooking on the cook stove. And it's no problem. No one's ever taught her how to cook, but here she is cooking on a cook stove that was supposedly damaged beyond repair. I also felt like there was no real character development, and I read this with my friend Dia from Novel Idea, and she described it well when she said that it read like a movie script that, then the actors can take and kind of make their own. So it felt really kind of bland, and it was such an interesting topic, basically about how these white children were taken by Native Americans and then at some point returned back to white people, and they were never able to fully assimilate back into society. And that's so fascinating. But she took that and made it not interesting. And also, there's no quotation marks in this book at all, and that really bothered me. So we've got people talking back and forth, and there's no, this person said this person said that. It's just there with no quotations and not saying who's saying what. So that got really confusing, and it also got confusing in terms of whether or not this is what someone is saying or what someone is thinking. And so I felt like that was a stylistic choice that was not a good one. It just made it really confusing. Book number 2 is The Black Pearl by Scott Odell. Scott Odell wrote The Island of the Blue Dolphins, which I really enjoyed as a kid. So I thought maybe I would like this one. I didn't. It's about this boy who his father sells pearls. So there are people that are part of his father's employ who are pearl divers, and he really, really wants to be one of those. And so he comes of an age where he's able to. The whole book, it's a middle grade book. He reads like he's like 10 or 12, but he's an adult. And that makes this super weird because he doesn't act like he is of an adult age. I forget what the coming of age was in the story. It was 16 or 18. I can't remember which, but he doesn't act like either of those ages. So he ends up becoming a pearl diver, and he ends up finding this pearl that is guarded by, I think it's like El Diablo or something, and it's like a stingray, and it just gets really weird because apparently if you take this pearl, there's a curse put on you, and it's really weird, and it doesn't make sense, and I don't understand it, and I probably maybe potentially spoiled some of the book because it's only 100 pages long, but this is all in the back of the book, so maybe I'm not spoiling it. I don't know. I only finished it because it was a summer book bingo prompt and it was only 100 pages, and I'm like, well, I'm gonna finish this even though this is one of the worst books that I've ever read. But it's not the worst book I've ever read. The worst book of this year, without question, is Where the Forest Meets the Stars. There actually were redeeming elements to this book, which is why I completed it. So there's this woman who, I think she's some sort of biologist, or she does something in nature, and she's studying different things in nature, birds and stuff. And that element, I feel like I liked how that was written. And so basically this girl shows up in her yard and claims that she's not from this world, and she can't go back to where she's from until she's witnessed X amount of miracles. I think it was 5, could have been 3, can't remember. Until she's witnessed a certain amount of miracles. And so this woman's trying to figure out, is this girl actually from this world? And if she is, where does she belong? How do we get her back to her home? Why is she away from her home? And if she is not from this world, is she an alien? Like, what is this? And so the premise was interesting, but there were some really extremely problematic things about this book. So I'm gonna talk spoilers now so I can tell you. So she encounters this young man who is kind of like a neighbor to where she is staying at the time. And he struggles with depression. And he is depressed for a number of reasons. He's had some really weird things that have happened in his childhood and stuff like that. And so he has things that he just can't do, you know, like he won't leave his house when he's having a depressive episode. So what does she do? She goes over and she forces him out of his house. He has never had a relationship with a woman before, and so he doesn't want to do certain physical things with her. So what does she do? She does that physical thing to him to show him that he actually does want it. Then he is like all upset about something, and she says like she's gonna cut his hair, and he's like, no, don't cut my hair. So what does she do? She cuts his hair. And then she forces him to interact with his biological father, which is a whole nother messy like affair situation that happened that was like really like glorified and was just not good. So basically the moral of the story is if you get in a relationship with someone who has a mental illness, all you have to do is force them out of their shell. If they tell you that they can't do something or they don't want you to do something, consent doesn't exist. You just need to push them out of their comfort zone that they're in. You just need to push them out, even though they're telling you no, you know what's best for them, even though you're not a therapist and they are clearly telling you no. Consent doesn't exist, and this is how you help someone with a mental illness. Because after she does these things, he's fine and he doesn't have any depressive episodes anymore. As someone who has struggled with depression, I was like, what the heck? This is the most toxic thing I've ever seen, and it's being glorified as super romantic that she is doing this for him because she cares about him. And I'm like, no, you're not. You're overstepping every single boundary, and you don't know squat about this guy. You just met him and you think you know what's best for him? It was so incredibly frustrating, and I feel like it was romanticizing manipulation and overriding consent and all of these things. And then in addition, we find out that the young girl has some things that have happened. So I guess I'm not being totally spoilery. They bring in a therapist and the little girl doesn't like this therapist. So they just decide she doesn't need therapy despite the things that she's been through. So they really put down like social workers and therapists and override all those boundaries as well. So I felt like this book was very much against like mental illness, against therapists, against healthy relationships, but was very pro like adultery if you want to, like that's cool. And you know what's best for people that you've barely met, even though you don't know their life stories. And oh my gosh, seriously, possibly the worst book I've ever read. I hated it. Well, thank you for attending this rant session. I hope that no one was offended by these books being, for me personally, the worst books. The nice part about books is that there are so many different types of books, different types of authors with different writing styles and different ways of portraying things that click really well for some people and other people hate them. Like, I'm sure that there are books that are my top books of the year that people absolutely despised, and there's like a whole wide range of different books for different people, and that's really wonderful. So if your experience with these books was absolutely loving them, I'm really, really glad that you did. And I'm not trying to disparage your experience in any way at all. I'd love to hear from you in the comments down below. What are some books that you really, really didn't like this year? Or if you're not enjoying a book, do you just not finish it? For some of these books, it was the ending that made me hate it. And for some of these books, I continued them because they were buddy reads, or because by the time I realized I didn't like them, I was already far enough that I figured I might as well finish it, or I was hoping that it would redeem itself because it was a well-loved book. But like I said, even out of these 12 books, there are only 4 that I like really very actively disliked. And only the top one is the only one that I can say that I like hated with a passion. And it's interesting because I actually rated it 2 stars on Goodreads because I'm like, well, there were elements to it that I liked, so I guess it's 2 stars. And now I'm looking back, I'm like, why would I have given that book 2 stars? Why? Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, please hit like and also subscribe so you can continue to see more bookish content from me, and I will see you again